Hello, my name is Dr. Catherine Tinker. I'm an attorney, law professor, and founder and president of the Tinker Institute on International Law and Organizations, also known as TIILO. We're welcoming everyone here who is listening or present at the UN DPI NGO conference in Gyeongju, Republic of Korea. And our workshop is entitled the Making a Difference, Good Governance, Rule of Law, and Compliance with the SDG Policy Framework for Sustainability and Growth to 2030. We are going to be exploring the role of the private sector, education of the private sector for compliance with the goals and targets in the global goals. First, a word about TILO's mission. Just to introduce our NGO, we were founded in 1992 and accredited to ECOSOC as an NGO in 1996. We have participated in meetings beginning with the first Rio Conference on Environment and Development in 1992, through the Rio Plus 20 Conference in 2012 on Sustainable Development, meetings of the Open Working Group on the Sustainable Development Goals over the last few years, and a number of conferences of the parties to various multilateral environmental agreements, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Convention on Wetlands of International Importance, the Ramsar Convention. The mission of TILO is to do research and teaching about the United Nations system. And to that end, we have brought in academics, faculty members, and students from a variety of universities around the world, principally in Brazil and the United States, so that these students and professors have the opportunity to participate in the work of the United Nations through the lens of our accredited NGO. I'd like to share with you now some of our experiences in formulating and contributing to the SDGs with a focus on Goal 16 as a crux, underpinning, if you will, for the achievement of all of the global goals. And I'll just note to begin that the goals themselves are a package. This is not a menu where a state or any party can choose one goal and ignore the rest. They are integrated, they are innovative, they are transformative, and they are unitary as well as universal in their application. And this is what makes the opportunity to achieve the global goals so important for our planet and for all forms of life on our Earth and in the oceans. So to focus now on how the SDGs were created, I should just note in beginning that it was a participatory, transparent process, that many of the targets that are contained in Goal 16 that call for this kind of access to information, participation in decision-making at all levels, the transparency of the process itself, all of these principles were in practice in the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals themselves. And that's why I think the member states of the United Nations in the General Assembly, when they adopted the global goals on September 25th of 2015, by consensus, these member states understood that the process we had gone through in the creation of these goals should now be used in their implementation at all levels: international, regional, national, and local. In Goal 16 specifically, the goal is a broad one, and it calls specifically to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. I'd like to talk about a few selected targets within Goal 16, as there are very many and they touch on many subjects. But in relation to good governance and corporate responsibility, I'd like to address Target 16.3, promote the rule of law at the national and international levels and ensure equal access to justice for all. What is the rule of law? Access to information and access to justice through the courts, access to and participation in decision-making, transparency in the operations of government, and accountability, the responsibility of states and of the private sector, as well as all stakeholders. Finally, legitimacy of the rules and the stability of the process, which is equally available to all. Conditions that foster the quality of life and an adequate standard of living for everyone, and also create conditions for business that create certainty and stability and allow investments to be made, which will benefit the working and the living conditions of all. In Target 16.5, substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all their forms. Studies have shown that one of the greatest impediments to equality, development, and dignity for all is corruption. Domestic laws in some countries, like, for example, the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, address bribery, and UN resolutions have attempted to limit this practice to achieve sustainable development and quality of life for all. This is a basic target. In Target 16.6, develop effective, accountable, and transparent institutions at all levels. We see the reference to holding decision makers responsible for their decisions and answerable to all citizens. Institutional approaches need to be developed to encourage this kind of accountability at international, regional, national, and local levels. In Target 16.7, ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels. This target reflects the belief that involvement of all stakeholders articulating their own concerns, sharing in discussion, and sharing in decision-making is the best means of achieving true sustainable development. Then the rules will hold a high degree of legitimacy and encourage compliance with the rules. In Target 16.8, broaden and strengthen the participation of developing countries in the institutions of global governance. This target shows how universal the aspirations are. That is not a top-down agenda, it is a bottom-up agenda. It recognizes that states have rights, but also duties and responsibilities under international and national law. It is a recasting of the traditional idea of overseas development assistance or foreign aid from developed countries to developing, to a concept of burden sharing that involves all member states of the UN in all parts of the world. And it recognizes that developing states have autonomy, sovereignty, and choices that will affect the ability of the whole world to achieve sustainable development, necessitating their direct participation and involvement in the institutions of global governance. And finally, in Target 16.10, ensure public access to information and protect fundamental freedoms in accordance with national legislation and international agreements. How is this in practice? Many multilateral environmental agreements, like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Ramsar Convention, the Biodiversity Convention, the Convention on Desertification, many other treaties that I could refer to here, contain binding obligations to provide access to information. This would be on the international level. On a regional level in Europe, for example, the Aarhus Convention provides the right of the public to have access to information, and this is an important component of citizen participation in the institutions of the European Union. The Target 16.10 also reinforces Target 16.7, since participation in decision-making requires access to information. And one example of how this works would be in the use of environmental impact assessments in planning development projects before they go forward, and involving citizens, communities, local governments, and other levels of stakeholders and participants in decisions, but that require access to information to be able to effectively participate. I'd like to mention now, beyond the Goal 16 and targets specifically, a UN initiative called the Global Compact. It has 10 principles for sustainable development and voluntary annual reporting by every corporation that promises and pledges to adopt these 10 principles. Why would business and industry be involved in these projects at the United Nations? For example, in Transforming Our World, the document that contained the final adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, Article 67 in the preamble that was agreed to by all 193 member states of the UN says, and I quote, "Private business activity, investment, and innovation are major drivers of productivity, inclusive economic growth, and job creation. We acknowledge the diversity of the private sector, ranging from micro-enterprises to cooperatives to multinationals. We call on all businesses to apply their creativity and innovation to solving sustainable development challenges." And in turn, the private sector, particularly those corporations who have joined the Global Compact, pledge to follow principles that relate to human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. And these 10 principles can be accessed on the website at www.unglobalcompact.org. They pledge to make global goals local business. And I think this is a good indication of how seriously the private sector takes the global goals. At this moment, companies that have joined the Global Compact of the United Nations include 8,610 companies in 163 countries, and they have made almost 40,000 public reports to date. One other initiative at the United Nations involving the private sector to mention is the UN Global Principles on Business and Human Rights. These are codes of conduct that are also voluntary, but they relate to sustainable procurement policies and also to reporting, an element of the Global Compact as well. That information can be found at business-humanrights.org/en/UN-guiding-principles. Okay. Finally, I would like to talk about corporate social and environmental responsibility as a principle of international law, as well as good business. States adopted the SDGs and are responsible for achieving the goals and targets, as we've been discussing. To do so involves the cooperation of all stakeholders, including the cooperation of the private sector. Why should business and industry be willing to change their practices to meet the goals and targets here in the global goals? First, I suggest voluntary compliance is good business. It helps the bottom line, builds brand loyalty, instills pride in the staff and community, uses best practices, which are most efficient, sustainable, cost-effective, and fair. The SDGs are action-oriented, smart, and universal, qualities that appeal to business. The SDGs aim to eradicate poverty with an integrated approach to sustainable development, social inclusion, economic empowerment, and environmental stewardship. All of this builds business and profits in the long term without depleting non-renewable resources, without destroying the social protection floors needed in communities, and still can lead to economic viability. The SDGs emphasize good governance, the rule of law, and well-functioning national institutions. This reduces corruption and creates a better environment for business to function, all necessary to operate, again, with certainty and predictability. A second point is that obligations through laws and regulations adopted by states and local governments are obligatory, and failure to follow such laws and regulations can be met with sanctions, fines, injunctive relief, and other penalties through arbitration and litigation. This creates a climate of uncertainty, can cost businesses, and can lead to great delays as these matters proceed through dispute resolution. Businesses need to resolve these matters and move on to their core operations. Compliance with international law principles and the obligations of states under treaties, customary law, and soft law, as well as the Jus Cogens human rights principles that must be observed by all in society worldwide, are principles that are now demanded by stakeholders and by shareholders. So it's simply good business as well as good law. And finally, education for good corporate citizenship applies to small and medium enterprises, to the informal sector, and as well to transnational corporations. Leading business schools in the Wharton, for example, Harvard, NYU in the United States, all teach the principles of social responsibility and environmental responsibility to their MBA candidates. They will come out and be the business leaders of the future, and they understand how important it is for the private sector to meet its responsibilities. And in that context, SDG goal number 12 addresses sustainable consumption and production along the entire supply chain, making responsibility shared among all of us, consumers, manufacturers, energy producers, and all in our mutually cooperative society. Thank you. I'd like to welcome now Alicia Sharabali, who is a senior at Seton Hall University, majoring in economics and international relations in the School of Diplomacy and International Relations. And Ms. Sharabali has a few questions as an intern this semester for the Tinker Institute on International Law and Organizations, and part of the planning process for this workshop. So please, I'd like to hear what you're thinking as a youth representative.
Dr. Tinker, first of all, thank you so much for this opportunity. My first question is that in countries where workers have little to no power in collective bargaining, many families find that the only way to find a livable or to have a livable income is by putting their children to work. So within India, for example, there's a huge issue with the private sector employing children and using them as a tool for cheaper labor. What sort of regulatory agencies could be helpful or more effective in the oversight of cases in countries where the observation and support of basic human rights is minimal at best?
That's a really important question. I think that the whole approach of the Sustainable Development Goals is a human rights-based approach.
Okay.
And specific parts of the global goals address the prohibition of child labor, as well as creating other social and environmental and economic conditions that would make it unnecessary for families to be in that difficult position, so that children could be in school where they belong, so they can contribute to their own futures and build their country's futures. I'd like to just mention, since you brought this up, specifically one of the other SDGs, Goal 8, Target 7, and I quote, "Take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor, end modern slavery and human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor, including recruitment and use of child soldiers, and by 2025, end child labor in all its forms." So that is a very important part of the global goals. I'd also mention it's in the UN Global Compact as one of the 10 principles to which the private sector subscribes. When they join the Global Compact, they pledge to uphold all 10 principles, including the elimination of child labor.
Thank you. And finally, Dr. Tinker, several issues that we face in implementing the SDGs are rooted in cooperation between the different levels of government and different governments themselves. What is the significance of Goal 16 in achieving the 2030 Agenda?
In my opinion, the idea of the rule of law and good governance underpins the targets and the goals throughout the SDGs. It's an important concept to see how they're all interrelated. It's impossible to isolate out any one of the SDGs because they can't be achieved without all the others. And it's not a choice for any government or group of any kind to pick and choose and say, well, we'll work on goal 14, but we don't care about goal 8. It doesn't work that way. And I think 16 in the SDGs gives us that framework, that it is an integrated approach, that it takes every level of government, that it takes the private sector, it takes civil society and all stakeholders, as well as individuals making those choices daily. How we live, how we use non-renewable resources, how we support the rights of one another for all to achieve ultimately the elimination of poverty.
Thank you so much for that.
I give you now Cristina de Hollanda, who will set the stage for what compliance means in actual practice, what it means for corporate attorneys, and why their clients are interested in the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Catherine, for the kind words and introduction. My name is Cristina de Hollanda, and I'm going to be talking about overcoming challenges and bias from the corporate sector in complying with the Sustainable Development Goals. 15 years ago, the United Nations outlined an agenda for the year 2015, which was known as the Millennium Development Goals. These aimed to measure progress on social, economic, and environmental conditions around the globe. As a response to new circumstances and challenges, the United Nations has adopted a new agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. The SDGs enumerate objectives for the next 15 years. In doing so, the United Nations recognized that absent responsible state governance, the successful implementation of the SDGs would depend on a strong involvement of the private sector. Statistics show that 300 of the top multinational companies retain approximately 1/4 of the world's capital. Some of them are wealthier than most foreign national governments, and as a result, they become equally responsible for addressing social issues. This is true especially in countries with limited resources. Due to the influence of these companies in national governments, one should encourage their duty to operate in a sustainable way, even when absent specific local rules demanding them to do so. One of the fundamental obstacles to the effective engagement of the private sector in sustainability efforts is the absence of a supranational legal framework to regulate the operation of transnational companies. In 1974, the United Nations recognized the need for a code of conduct to regulate multinationals in the third world countries. The United Nations Commission of Transnational Corporations elaborated a code of conduct on transnational corporations, the UNCTC. This code was not adopted until more than 10 years later, but it was never implemented. The code failed because it aimed to apply excessive responsibility of transnationals, which was much higher than the standards adopted by governmental standards. In this context, self-regulation emerged as an alternative of global or international normatization. However, evidence shows that less than 10% of transnational companies do have global guidelines. The reasons for it are justified on the different grounds. Some argue that the granting of fiscal incentives by the public sector is a prerequisite to engage private corporations in sustainable development. Others believe that corporate social responsibility can only serve as nothing more than a marketing tool. Finally, there are some that believe that forcing a company to comply with higher standards than those predicted by law is simply incompatible with a corporate duty they have to maximize profits. In this context, self-regulation emerged as an alternative to global or international normatization. However, evidence shows that less than 10% of transnational companies do have global guidelines. The reasons for it are justified on the different grounds. Some argue that the granting of fiscal incentives by the public sector is a prerequisite to engage private corporations in sustainable development. Others believe that corporate social responsibility can only serve as nothing more than a marketing tool. Finally, there are those who believe that forcing a company to comply with higher standards than those predicted by law is simply incompatible with their corporate duty to maximize profits. I will present some of these arguments and illustrate possible paths to encourage corporations to act more sustainably. I will also argue how corporate compliance with the SDGs can be reconcilable with the corporate governance. I expect this approach will help strengthen the trust of the private sector in the program delineated by the United Nations and facilitate a partnership between private and public sectors, thereby making achievement of the SDGs viable in the long term. First, I'll talk about the argument of the need of fiscal incentives to facilitate a self-regulatory global framework. There are two main arguments against self-regulation in the absence of local rules. One, that it's not profitable. And second, that because it's not profitable, it would violate the corporate fiduciary principle and the shareholder primacy rule. If correct, these propositions would support the conclusion that the only possible way to promote sustainability is through fiscal incentives and exemptions. Nevertheless, these arguments are not universal truths. Studies show that decisions by socially conscious consumers may have a devastating impact on corporate profits. A primary example of this is the experience of Starbucks in Guatemala a decade ago. Starbucks was forced to confront issues of corporate responsibility because the exploitation of lower label standards tainted their corporate image and adversely impacted investment and sales. There are other examples showing the same, and U.S. multinationals have therefore acknowledged the importance and economic benefit of adopting higher standards of conduct than those demanded by local governments. Their internal codes, however, can provide some line for debate. Some of them can provide consistent, uniform standards for multinationals' efficient management of labor rights and environmental concerns. In addition, global codes put countries on notice of what their business standards are. However, voluntary self-regulation may prove insufficient due to a lack of accountability. Internal codes may comply with basic international norms, but many don't address the consequences of non-compliance. In addition, multinationals may feel competitively disadvantaged when faced with local competitors operating under lower legal standards, and as a result, their internal codes may be viewed more as a marketing tool to benefit the image of the business rather than effectively an instrument to promote sustainability. In America, the cost of non-compliance can be onerous and frequently exceed any short-term economic benefit or opportunity that unlawful or illegal conduct may create. Even in the absence of regulation, the long-term effect of non-sustainable business practice can be negative because of the resulting reputational risk among customers, employees, and governmental agencies, resulting in a statistically significant loss in the firm's market value. However, corporations differ from one another in the way they weigh sustainability and profitability. For most, the principle of the shareholder primacy, under which profitability is the driving factor in decision making, means that businesses should go beyond what is required by law only if doing so is demonstrably profitable. And in that environment, a commitment to sustainability as a goal in itself is difficult to reconcile with the corporation's principal reason of being, which is to make money for its investors. In the US, the doctrine of shareholder supremacy emerged in the early 20th century. In Dodge versus Ford Motor Company, the Supreme Court of Michigan wrote that a business corporation is organized and carried on primarily for the profit of the stockholders. Plus, in applying the shareholder primacy doctrine, courts have often applied a business judgment rule. This means that They do not second-guess management's decisions, provided that management has acted consciously on the basis of full information and in the belief that its decisions were in the best interest of the corporation. However, this deference to managerial decision-making does not extend to acts that violate law, even where those acts may serve to increase profits, as is the case of illegal activities. From this, we can conclude that the doctrine of shareholder supremacy is not absolute, and that management's responsibility is not the maximization of profits at all costs. Rather, it's a rule of enhancement of profits. We can also conclude that managers enjoy a reasonable, though undefined, measure of discretion in determining how to fulfill their fiduciary obligations to stockholders. Nonetheless, company decision makers have generally been wary of implementing sustainability motivated actions that depart from a profit maximizing objective. In addition, many executives perceive informal compliance with law as a somewhat utopian and unrealistic goal. My conclusion is that in the absence of comprehensive supranational legal framework to compel the consideration of sustainability in corporate decision making, concepts of corporate law and market forces will continue to be dominant factors in framing the role of corporate sector. The two factors, corporate law and market forces, will likely become increasingly intertwined and should not be treated as separate and unrelated matters. As we have seen, corporate law establishes the basic parameters within which corporate decision makers may properly operate and defines the limits of what is and is not permissible. But within those limits, market forces are increasingly influencing decisions that affect sustainability. Norms of corporate conduct continue to evolve, driven in large measure by consumer awareness, to the point that the climate now favors an approach that is proactive rather than reactive. In other words, corporations see tangible benefits by establishing and adhering to codes of conduct, not because it is what consumers are demanding, but because it's what consumers are likely to demand in the foreseeable future. And, as in the commercial area generally, there is a benefit in being the first to market. Taking the lead in these initiatives need not entail a competitive disadvantage, because by addressing sustainability issues forthrightly, members of the corporate sectors can help create the very climate in which a responsible corporate approach to sustainability comes to be perceived as the new norm, the minimum standard that society demands of its corporate citizens. This approach, however, also benefits from the adoption of standardized criteria to establish goals and measure performance. The International Standards Organization, for instance, has been very active in creating standards for measuring the carbon footprint on different business operations. These standards should not be seen as a challenge to existing principles of corporate law, such as the doctrine of shareholder primacy. Instead, they should be viewed as complementary measures to help guide corporate decision-making in an increasingly complex international market. Advocates of increased regulatory oversight may argue that reliance on private initiative, whether in the corporate sector or through non-governmental organizations such as the ISO, is not necessarily the ideal solution. Nevertheless, in the area of sustainability, time does not allow the best to be the enemy of the good. That, indeed, is the fundamental message in the United Nations agenda. Thank you very much for your time.
Now I would like to open up to a few questions, and we have a representative of youth speaking. This is Kayla Wyman, who is one of our interns with Tylo this year from Seton Hall University, from the School of Diplomacy and International Relations. So we're going to give her the opportunity to ask a couple of questions directly to Cristina de Hollanda and to me, and then we will be opening it up, of course, later to more questions from all of you. Kayla.
Hello, thank you for having me here. So our first question, as both of you have explained in your speeches, there are many ways world leaders, NGOs, civil society, and member states can work together to achieve the SDGs. What are some other ways a local citizen or student can get involved? Dr. Tinker, you touched on this during your speech, and you also see students every day at Seton Hall University. What is your perspective?
Well, I think really the success of this SDGs, the whole agenda lies in our individual hands because we all have responsibility. So in our daily lives, we make choices, consumption and production. We buy certain products, we take shorter showers, we conserve water and energy. We make choices in how we transport ourselves. We make choices when we go to the supermarket, and we make choices when we vote. So all of these things are really important. But beyond that, for educated students and for those of us participating in this workshop, for you and your cohorts, Kayla, it's important to also talk to everybody you know. Talk to your friends and your family. Write an opinion piece for your local newspaper when you go home at the holidays. Be involved in the work of your neighborhood and your community. Join an NGO, as you have, and go to conferences. Be part of the process and monitor what your government is doing. Not only monitor, but be involved. And if they say they're complying, follow it up and make sure. See for yourself. Get information and use that information. And understand that many of these choices are done through local communities now because they involve land use practices, licensing, approvals for development, environmental impact assessments. These are all local policy and legal decisions to be made. So local people need to be really aware and
The
involved.
question is for Cristina. You mentioned in your speech that some companies within states are wealthier than local governments at times. And because of that, multinational companies and local governments share the responsibility together of addressing social issues. How do you think companies will respond to this more integrated partnership or local governments?
Well, perhaps some will see this as more of an ethical, broader ethical, realistic, or even philosophical argument. But to me, power and responsibility do go hand in hand. And when you do have that much power, economic power, you end up having to take responsibility over the social issues that are right in front of you, because this is the communities are going to be their consumers. The communities are going to be their workers and their consumers. So there is no way to just benefit one side of the balance.
I would like to open the floor to both of you. If you could wrap up or kind of briefly summarize why it is beneficial for companies and multinational corporations to comply with the SDGs and make an effort to have a more globally partnered society.
So in the context of profitability that I was talking about, the summary is any short-term benefit, economic benefit you can gain from deriving from any illegal activity or unlawful act from the company doesn't compensate in the long term. It doesn't compensate because the costs outweigh any benefit. It's the cost of to have to defend yourself from prosecution or investigation, then not to mention the penalties and fines, but also to establish mechanisms to control what happens in the company and creating rules of compliance. All of this just adds up at the end of the day, and we have studies that show concrete examples that companies that don't comply and had to face penalties oftentimes had an impact on their reputation, causing a decrease in market value of their shares, for instance, up to 2.5%, which in every single case was about 10 times higher than the cost of the penalty itself. So crime does not compensate. Non-compliance does not compensate. Catherine, do you want to add anything?
Absolutely, I concur. And because we've been talking about corruption as well, tax evasion, bribery, these are crimes. So in addition to administrative sanctions and penalties and interest charges, there are also crimes to be accounted for by corporations as well as by executives of corporations. And this applies to the whole group of the 17 SDGs, to the social protection floor, to the protections for labor, the right to decent work, to the human rights framework in which all of the SDGs are situated. And the corporate responsibility applies to social as well as environmental protection through all of these. So thank you for that question, Kelly.
Thank you for your input. Thank you all for watching today. And we will have more discussion in our interactive live Skype session. Thank you.
The 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, more particularly Goal 16 and 16.2, speaks in terms of, I quote, promoting peaceful and sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions for all, end of quote. Goal 16 focuses on violence, which I find quite inappropriate, bearing in mind that violence exists daily against children in war zones. Goal 16.9.9 speaks as regards stateless children. There are numerous children who are stateless today as a direct result of conflicts, more particularly what is existing today in Syria. The 21st century has not fulfilled the aspirations of peace and security, of peace and progress, and has not dissipated tensions and violence. Terrorism constitutes a grave threat to international peace and security and has devastating effects on children globally. Over the last few decades, the international community has striven to improve the mental and physical integrity of children by implementing firstly the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, and secondly the Sustainable Development Goals. The plight of women and children in conflict zones was not originally taken into consideration. During these years, the collective perceptions and the concept of international security has changed. Children are at the forefront of this phenomena and suffer the most. Armed conflicts across the world affect the poorest countries and is destroying the hopes and aspirations of generations of children. Their fundamental rights are being infringed. Conflict has indeed a negative impact on education, health, and the psychological well-being of children in zones of conflicts. Disruptions caused by conflict has a negative impact on children's health, education, and their well-being. By ignoring the plight of children in zones of conflict who are deprived of food security and education is both dangerous and inhumane. The emerging new realities requires a multicultural response and indeed a political will to contribute to substantive outcomes to peace and global security. Despite the rights of children as enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child and numerous United Nations resolutions, children are being exposed daily to violence globally, be it in war zones or in domestic and international settings. Children are being impacted by human trafficking, sexual violence, and conflict. The United Nations Global Compact traces a tremendous amount on public-private partnership. They are indeed vehicles to sustainably eradicating poverty. Alone we may have an idea, but together in partnership there is action. The international community needs to take into consideration the plight of the female child soldiers. A great deal of attention has been paid to the male child soldiers. One rarely speaks or indeed focuses on the plight of the female child soldiers. DDR programs, which are internationally integrated into post-conflict zones, do not appear to have any effective means or take into consideration the emerging phenomena of the female child soldier. It begs the questions, how can they effectively reintegrate into society, and more particularly in their own village, after they have witnessed, the female child soldiers have witnessed, executed, and above all, endured so much. A growing phenomenon is the fact that children nowadays in war zones are both symbols and swords in war zones. The UNICEF's recent report revealed the brutality of Boko Haram, particularly as regards its use of girls, as female suicide bombers. My recommendations as regards the Sustainable Development Goals and 2030 Agenda is that in reality they're quite unrealistic. We live in a world which is focusing so much on terrorism and conflict. These goals must take these into considerations. We're shifting from the Cold War and detente to a changing world where conflicts and terrorism abound. In conclusion, we need to take into consideration the shifting paradigms of the 21st century where terrorism abounds. More particularly, we need to focus on the threat of ISIS as a threat to international peace and security. Thank you. I'd like to now focus on the development consequences of armed conflicts and wars and the Sustainable Development Goal and the 2030 Agenda. War is a development issue. War not only kills but also affects the development of a country torn by war. Whilst the Millennium Development Goals and subsequently the Sustainable Development Goals focused on wars as a global consensus of development priorities, yet so far not much has been done to date as an extensive research on the impact of war and conflicts on the said goals. It begs the questions, firstly, what is the negative impact of conflict on development outcomes? Secondly, to what extent is there a gap between conflict countries and other countries as a direct result of conflicts themselves? We're all well aware that civil wars can create havoc on economies. It is particularly harsh on resources, disruption of social order, diversion of public expenditure, disabling and the shifting of assets out of the country. The impact of war is tremendous, not only on health, but also on poverty and hunger and the education of children in these zones, and also on child mortality. The impact of war also has effects on access to water and sanitation. Countries in zones of conflicts are less favorably able to secure the goals of both the Millennium Development Goals indicators and also the Sustainable Development Goals, which are a follow-on to the MDGs, which in my opinion failed to such an extent. In a large country, conflict may be extremely detrimental to particular goals, more particularly those of sustaining peace, development, education, the health and infant mortality. Evidence also reveals that there's no effect on conflict and access to sanitation facilities. In conclusion, the SDGs achievement during conflict and after is inappropriate and unachievable. Armed conflicts are important obstacles to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda. The consequences of conflict on development remain immediate and above all persistent. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to now answer some questions which have been sent to me from some students. First of all, let me read out the questions, then I'll try my best to answer them. I have in front of me 4 questions. The first question is, I quote, regarding Goal 16, Target 9, providing legal identity to all, do you believe this will create international citizenship to all, including stateless persons, or solve the conflicts creating stateless persons? The second question is, the link between the absence of violence and development is proven by an overwhelming amount of evidence. Does Goal 16 accurately represent this? The third question, the Millennium Development Goals report published in 2015 states that conflict remains the biggest threat to human development. When looking at the success of any initiative, it seems only logical to measure it by impact on the most vulnerable. Do you believe the Sustainable Development Goals has placed enough importance on the issue of children affected by conflict, specifically child soldiers? Let me take the first question regarding stateless children, stateless persons. As I said at the beginning, Goal 16 speaks in terms of an inclusive and peaceful society. Now, if we look around the world globally today, more particularly the conflict in Syria, there are numerous stateless persons, particularly stateless children. Now, by statelessness, it means that the children do not belong to a particular state. The children of Syria are now finding refuge, seeking refuge in various countries, going across first to Turkey and to Jordan. What is their position, their states, their citizenship in these countries? My answer to this question is that Goal 16 has not really taken into consideration the question of statelessness. The children, refugee children, are stateless. They may be given refuge or they may be in camps in Jordan, but they do not belong to Jordan. They are not citizens of Jordan. They're not citizens of Turkey. And as we have now seen, the conflict and the problems which they're encountering in Germany and the European countries, they are, in effect, stateless, which is indeed a most troubling situation in the 21st century. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees has done a tremendous work in addressing this issue of the statelessness of children. I believe the international community must take note and do more to guarantee the citizenships of refugee persons, more particularly women and children. If I now go on to the second question regarding violence and development, and whether Goal 16 accurately represents this. As I spoke in my presentation, there's a link between development and conflict. As there's a saying that there's no peace without development, and there's no development without peace. I, for one, believe that Goal 16, as I've said, is quite lofty. It does not take into consideration the realities of the link between development and peace in the 21st century. Conflict has a tremendous effect on development. War zones, countries in war zones and post-conflict settings will not achieve development. They will not achieve the lofty goals of the Sustainable Development Goals. If I can now go on to the question of child soldiers. In 2012, I hosted an event at the United Nations on the incidents of the female child soldiers. As I've said, the international community has not taken much attention, not paid much attention to the plight of child soldiers, more particularly female child soldiers. At the said event, I was privileged to have Fatou Bensouda, the current head of the International Criminal Court, the chief prosecutor, at the event to give a keynote speech of the plight of female child soldiers, in which she assured us that more emphasis will be paid to the plight of the female child soldiers, and more particularly when they're giving testimony at the International Criminal Court at The Hague. Yet again, the 2015 Millennium Development Report did not put emphasis on child soldiers, be them female or male. There's a need to shift from this paradigm shift and to focus on the plight of child soldiers globally. In conflict zones, child soldiers do exist. We're now seeing child soldiers being used in Nigeria by Boko Haram, and there will be emergence of child soldiers in the not too distant future in the conflict in Syria.